The Mapmaker's Wife. By Melanie Gallant. Episode 1. Maggie Sinclair had not wanted to go to the ceilidh. The October wind had come in sharp off the North Sea all afternoon, rattling the windows of her parents' cottage until the glass hummed in its frames. By evening, the lanes glistened from an earlier shower, and every sensible part of her wanted to stay home with a cup of tea and the novel she'd borrowed from the village library. Instead, her best friend, Catriona, had appeared at the door wearing a green wool dress and the determined expression that meant refusal was pointless. "You've hidden in this house long enough," she'd declared. "There'll be music, dancing, and enough oatcakes to feed half the Highlands." "There'll also be half the Highlands," Maggie had replied. "Exactly." Now she stood in the village hall of the small coastal town of Stonehaven, wondering whether she'd been right all along. The hall was warm enough to fog the windows. Fiddles sang from the raised platform where 3 musicians played with infectious enthusiasm, accompanied by a piano that had certainly seen better decades. Laughter rose over the music as couples stumbled through reels and jigs, skirts swirling, polished shoes tapping against the worn wooden floor. The room smelled of beeswax, damp wool, peat smoke clinging to coats, and fresh shortbread cooling on long tables against the wall. It felt wonderfully alive. Maggie lingered near the refreshments, smoothing invisible creases from her blue dress. "You look like you're waiting for a bus," Catriona teased before disappearing into another dance. Left alone, Maggie watched instead. She liked watching people. An elderly couple moved across the floor with the effortless rhythm of 50 years together, speaking without words as they anticipated every turn. Young fishermen laughed as they missed steps but recovered with dramatic bows. Children darted beneath adults' arms until their mothers caught them by their collars. Every person seemed to belong exactly where they stood. Every person except her. She reached for a piece of shortbread. "So," said a quiet voice beside her, "do you think they're dancing north?" She blinked. The man standing beside her wasn't handsome in the obvious sense. He was tall and lean, with dark brown hair constantly falling across his forehead despite several absent-minded attempts to smooth it back. His tweed jacket looked as though it had already accompanied him across half of Scotland, and a leather satchel hung over one shoulder. His eyes, however, caught her attention immediately. Green. Not bright green, but the muted green of sea glass worn smooth by years of waves. "I'm sorry," she asked. He nodded toward the dancers. The set started facing the stage. He watched the spinning couples thoughtfully. "They're gradually drifting toward the east wall." She frowned. "I don't think dancing has directions." "Oh, everything has directions." His answer came without arrogance. It sounded less like an argument and more like a simple fact he'd spent years noticing. She looked back at the dancers. Now that he'd mentioned it. "They are moving. They always do." He smiled, not triumphantly, but with quiet delight that someone else had seen it too. "I'm Alasdair Fraser." "Maggie Sinclair." He offered his hand. His handshake was warm, his fingers calloused despite the ink stain smudged along the side of his thumb. Not the hands of a fisherman. Not quite the hands of a farmer either. "You work outdoors?" she asked. He glanced down, surprised. "Sometimes. I guessed from your hands. They're mostly stained with ink." She laughed softly. "I noticed. I'm apprenticing with the Ordnance Survey." Her eyebrows lifted. "You make maps?" "I try to." There was such modesty in the answer that it made her smile again. "My father says I disappear into landscapes more than I actually measure them." "Can one do both?" "I hope so." A lively reel erupted across the room, prompting cheers from the crowd. Someone called Alasdair's name from across the hall. "You coming?" "In a minute," he answered before turning back to Maggie. "I've never actually learned these dances properly." "You noticed everyone else's feet before your own." "I was watching the room." "So was I." For a moment they simply stood together. Neither seemed uncomfortable with the silence. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the windows. "I grew up near Inverurie," Alasdair said eventually. "First time I've been to this hall." "I'm from just outside here." He nodded as though adding a detail to an invisible chart. I took the coastal road. Most visitors do. I didn't. She tilted her head. I came across the old cliff path. That hasn't been marked properly in years. I know. You could have gotten lost. I didn't. There wasn't any boastfulness in the statement. Only certainty. She found herself unexpectedly curious. What made you take that path? The map was wrong. She laughed. No. It was. No, I mean. She smiled. Most people would simply choose the easier road. But then I'd never know where the other one went. Something about the way he said it settled quietly inside her. Not dramatic. Not romantic. Simply true. The musicians paused to retune. Conversation filled the hall. Alasdair reached into his satchel. I've probably frightened you already. You've mostly confused me. That's better. He pulled out a folded sheet of thick paper. I was sketching while waiting. She expected a landscape. Instead, she found herself looking at the village. Every lane. Every stone building. The harbour. The church. The curve of the shoreline. Even the little footbridge she'd crossed that afternoon. All drawn entirely in pencil. When did you make this? She whispered. Earlier today. You couldn't possibly remember all this. I usually can. She traced the air above the page without touching it. It wasn't simply accurate. It felt loved. Every line had been drawn with patience. Not because the buildings were important, but because someone had cared enough to see them. You've even drawn Mrs. McLaren's greenhouse. He grinned. I nearly forgot it. No one remembers her greenhouse. I liked the way the light hit the glass. She looked at him differently then. Not as a man showing off his skill. As someone who believed that places deserved to be remembered. The fiddler struck up another tune. This one slower. Gentler. A few couples wandered back onto the floor. Alasdair folded the map carefully. I've been terribly rude. You have. I haven't asked whether you dance. A little. Would you? She hesitated. Not because she didn't want to. Because she wasn't very good. I'll tread on your feet. I know where they'll be. The joke was so unexpected that she laughed aloud. Several nearby heads turned. She realized she'd never heard herself laugh quite like that. She slipped her hand into his. His grip was gentle. Steady. They joined the line of dancers just as the caller began explaining the steps. Maggie missed the first turn. Alasdair apologized, though it had been entirely his fault. They both went the wrong direction during the second figure. By the third, they were laughing too hard to care. The elderly couple she'd admired earlier smiled knowingly as they passed. Outside, beyond the fogged windows, the North Sea rolled endlessly against the shore, wearing away stone grain by grain, tide after tide. Inside the hall, among music and laughter and the scent of peat smoke, two young strangers found themselves turning in imperfect circles. Neither of them could have known that they had just stepped onto a path they would walk together for more than 50 years. Nor that one day, long after the maps had yellowed with age and the dances had faded into memory, one of them would spend her days tracing the routes the other could no longer find. But if anyone had looked closely enough in that first dance, they might have noticed something small and almost impossible to name. He always knew where they were. And somehow, even then, she already felt like home. That was episode 1 of The Mapmaker's Wife. Episode 2 will be out tomorrow. If you liked this episode, please leave a like and comment your thoughts down below. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to stay updated on new episodes coming out. There'll be an episode daily from now on. Thank you for listening. Until next time.